The desert night lay heavy over the Valley of the Kings. The wind whispered through the barren cliffs, like the sighs of spirits long forgotten. In the flicker of a lone torch, the carved walls came alive, images of Anubis, the jackal-headed god, guardian of the afterlife, his hollow eyes seeming to follow every trespasser. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter achieved what many thought impossible. He uncovered the tomb of the boy king, Tutankhamun. Inside, the team beheld a dream made real: gleaming gold, sacred statues, and a coffin that weighed hundreds of pounds. Yet, along with treasure, they had also unsealed something far darker, a tale that would haunt the 20th century. For it was said that etched upon the stone walls lay a warning: death shall come swiftly to those who disturb the king's rest. At first, it was nothing more than a chilling rumor. But then, death arrived. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy benefactor who funded the expedition, perished suddenly after a mere mosquito bite turned septic. He died only months after setting foot inside the tomb. The news spread like wildfire, newspapers around the globe proclaiming it as proof of an ancient curse reborn. Soon, others connected to the excavation also fell, some from mysterious illnesses, others from accidents, and a few from deaths no one could quite explain. Whispers began to take hold. Was this truly the vengeance of the pharaohs? The press gave it a name that sent chills through the Western world: the death shadow of Egypt. Fear took root. It spread through parlors, libraries, and taverns, gripping the public imagination with icy hands. But beneath the hysteria, one haunting question echoed across generations. Was this truly divine retribution from beyond the grave? Or nothing more than tragedy woven into myth by the human hunger for the mysterious?
In the early 20th century, the Western world was caught between two extremes. It was the age of electric light, the roaring engine, and the first airplane slicing through the sky. Science was advancing, industry was booming, and yet, paradoxically, it was also an age obsessed with mystery, with ghosts, with the forbidden whispers of the afterlife. For many, ancient Egypt became the perfect escape from the sterile modern age. To the Western imagination, Egypt was not just a land, it was a living museum. Every grain of sand might hide a god. Every tomb promised a glimpse into a universe both sacred and terrifying. The colossal sphinxes, the pyramids that defied time, the mummified kings who seemed untouched by death, all of it pointed to something humans had always craved: immortality. By the 1910s, a full-blown Egyptomania was already underway. Plays, novels, seances all drew from pharaohs and their eternal spells. Even as factories poured smoke into the sky, the West was secretly longing for the raw, primal magic of the desert. And then, in 1922, the world was given exactly what it had been yearning for. Howard Carter, after years of digging beneath the relentless sun, finally uncovered the sealed doorway to Tutankhamun's tomb. When Carter peered into the chamber by candlelight, he breathed words that would echo through history. "Yes, I see wonderful things." And wonderful they were: gleaming gold, jeweled thrones, statues of gods. But beyond treasure, Carter had delivered something even more precious to the modern world: a story. The newspapers knew it instantly. This was more than archaeology. It was a stage play written in sand and stone. Tutankhamun was no longer just a forgotten boy king. He became a figure of legend, cloaked in divine power, capable of punishing intruders across the centuries. Then came the first death. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy benefactor who financed Carter's dig, died suddenly in April 1923. What began as a simple mosquito bite turned septic, spreading infection through his blood. Medicine could explain it clearly, but the press was not interested in medicine. The press wanted something darker, something that would sell. And so the headline screamed, "The curse of the Pharaoh strikes the tomb's financier." The story exploded across Europe and America. Sensational papers claimed that when Carnarvon breathed his last in Cairo, the city was plunged into darkness by a sudden blackout. Some even swore that his beloved dog, waiting thousands of miles away in England, howled and collapsed dead at the exact same moment. Coincidence? Yes. But to the public, it was proof that the pharaoh still wielded their ancient wrath. Other deaths, rare and scattered, were quickly pulled into the narrative. A few members of the expedition succumbed to illness or accidents over the years. Many more lived long, uneventful lives, but the newspapers ignored them. Why let facts spoil a perfect horror story? The public devoured every word. In cafes, in theaters, in drawing rooms, people whispered about the curse. The age of seances and ghost stories had found its ultimate tale, a real-life curse carved in stone, rising from the sands. Carnarvon's death ceased to be a medical misfortune. It became a chilling sermon, a warning that the gods are real and they are watching. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was fear. And it was fear that gave the legend its power, fear that transformed a few tragic deaths into a myth that would outlive empires. Thus was born the Curse of the Pharaohs, not merely a superstition scrawled in a tomb, but a collective nightmare etched into the imagination of an entire civilization.
The idea of a curse was intoxicating, mystical, terrifying, irresistible. But as the decades passed, a quieter, more rational voice began to challenge the legend. Scientists, doctors, and historians asked, if not divine wrath, then what? The answer, it turned out, lay not in the heavens, but in the very air of the tombs themselves. Deadly passengers in the dark. When modern researchers examined Egyptian burial chambers, they found something far more mundane and far more lethal than magic. Inside the sealed, airless tombs, scientists detected colonies of toxic mold and bacteria, preserved for centuries in the stagnant darkness. Among them was Aspergillus niger, a fungus capable of producing deadly spores. When inhaled, these spores could inflame the lungs, leading to respiratory failure or dangerous fevers. There were also strains of Staphylococcus bacteria, opportunistic killers that thrive on the skin and in the bloodstream, capable of turning a simple wound into a death sentence. For the ancients, these microbial assassins were invisible, unknown. But for those who broke into tombs centuries later, archaeologists, explorers, even looters, the air itself might have been the curse. The conditions of early archaeology. The early 20th century was a golden age of exploration, but it was also an age of primitive safety standards. Protective masks were rarely used. Ventilation systems were crude or non-existent. Imagine stepping into a chamber that had been sealed for over 3,000 years, where air had not moved since the reign of the pharaohs. The first breath would draw in centuries of dust, spores, and decay. To modern science, this is not the breath of gods, but the breath of death. Stress, exhaustion, and poor medical treatment only made things worse. An archaeologist who inhaled enough spores might develop pneumonia or a systemic infection. In a time before antibiotics, such conditions could be fatal. The case of Lord Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon's death is perhaps the most famous and the most misunderstood. The newspapers of 1923 framed it as divine punishment, the pharaoh striking down the man who disturbed his eternal rest. But when examined under the cold light of medicine, the case tells a different story.
Carnarvon had a chronic history of health issues, weakened by a near-fatal car accident years before. His immune system was fragile. While in Egypt, he was bitten on the face by a mosquito. The wound became infected, then worsened after he accidentally nicked it while shaving. What followed was sepsis, blood poisoning that overwhelmed his body. Today, we understand it as an unlucky chain of events. To the press of the 1920s, it was the perfect murder weapon of the gods. Selective deaths, selective memory. One of the most damning arguments against the curse is statistics. Out of dozens of archaeologists, workers, and officials connected to Tutankhamun's tomb, the vast majority lived long, full lives. Howard Carter himself, the man who actually opened the tomb, lived another 16 years, dying peacefully in 1939 at the age of 64. If the Pharaoh's vengeance was real, why would it strike some and spare others? The truth is simpler, though far less dramatic. Only a handful died under unusual or early circumstances, and those deaths were amplified, repeated, and embroidered by the press. The living were ignored. The dead became icons of the curse. Science drains the mystery, yet the myth survives. By the late 20th century, medical journals and historical analyses had largely dismantled the idea of a supernatural curse. Mold spores, bacteria, poor ventilation, weak immune systems, these were killers far more plausible than the wrath of gods. And yet, the legend persisted. Why? Because fear thrives where facts cannot compete. Because a death explained by microbes does not make headlines, but a death explained by an ancient king's curse, that can grip an entire civilization. Between two worlds. This is the paradox of the curse of the pharaohs. On one side lies science, calm, rational, clinical. On the other lies superstition, wild, seductive, unforgettable. The mold can kill a man, yes, but only the curse can kill him in the imagination of millions. And so the story lived on, not because the gods struck with lightning hands, but because the human mind craves mystery more than truth.
Fear has always been the oldest magic. It does not require incantations or gods, or even curses carved in stone. It needs only the human imagination and the human terror of death. Why do we believe in curses? The answer lies in the shadow we all carry, the knowledge that life is fragile, that death comes for us all. Ancient Egypt, with its towering tombs and eternal mummies, embodied that shadow more vividly than any other civilization. Here was a culture obsessed with death, yet also with conquering it. Pharaohs built pyramids not as monuments to life, but as fortresses against oblivion. So when Westerners stepped into those tombs, they were not just entering ancient chambers. They were stepping into the very heart of humanity's greatest fear, the afterlife. Surrounded by painted walls of gods weighing souls, jackal-headed guardians, and warnings inscribed in hieroglyphs, it was almost impossible not to believe. The fear was already there. All it needed was a spark. The psychology of suggestion. Modern psychology has a name for this, the nocebo effect. If a person is convinced that something will harm them, their body can respond with real symptoms: stress, nausea, fever, even organ failure. Anxiety weakens the immune system, sleepless nights erode health, and soon the imagined curse becomes a tangible illness. In the 1920s, few understood this science, but they felt its power. An archaeologist who read of death for the desecrator might begin to cough, then sweat, then panic. A minor infection could spiral into a lethal condition fueled not only by bacteria, but by the crushing weight of belief. The mind, in its terror, can make its own curses real. Self-fulfilling tragedies. There are recorded cases of individuals who fell ill shortly after entering Egyptian tombs, not from toxins or mold, but from sheer obsession with the curse. Some developed psychosomatic symptoms, shortness of breath, heart palpitations, sudden collapse. Their belief in the curse was so overwhelming that their bodies seemed to obey it. One example often cited is Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy. Within days, he died suddenly of an unknown illness. To believers, it was the Pharaoh's wrath. To skeptics, it was coincidence, yet the timing sealed his fate in public memory. Cases like this only strengthened the myth. Each unexplained death became fuel. Each anxious whisper became another thread in the tapestry of fear. Fear as ancient weapon. But long before Carter and Carnarvon, long before European newspapers, the Egyptians themselves understood the psychology of fear. They knew that fear could outlast soldiers, walls, even death itself. And so on some tombs they carved curses, not to summon gods, but to frighten men. Inscriptions warned, "Cursed be he who moves my body. Death shall strike him with 1,000 afflictions." These were not spells in the magical sense. They were deterrents, the same way we might place a warning sign on a locked door. To a potential grave robber, standing alone at night with only an oil lamp, the thought of divine punishment could be as real as any guard. Fear was a weapon, and it worked. The curse lives in the mind. By the time Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, the modern world had forgotten how potent such weapons could be. But the principle was the same. Fear spread from whispers to headlines, from headlines to households. A man did not need to see a god's wrath to believe it. He only needed to feel his heart race at night, to hear of Carnarvon's fate, to imagine his own. And once fear takes root, it is almost impossible to uproot. The pharaohs may not have cursed Carter's men, but the fear they inspired across centuries, across continents, proved just as deadly. The real curse. So what was then the true power of the curse of the pharaohs? It was not microbes, though they killed some. It was not gods, for they remained silent. The true power was belief. Belief that death lurked in every shadow of the tomb. Belief that to touch the treasures of the king was to invite ruin. Belief so strong that it turned anxiety into sickness, coincidence into fate, and fear into a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the end, the curse was never carved in stone. It was carved in the human mind.
If fear was the spark, the media was the oxygen. The curse of the pharaohs might have flickered briefly and died had it not been fanned into an inferno by newspapers, publishers, and an entertainment industry hungry for sensation. A perfect story for a hungry press. The early 20th century was the golden age of sensational journalism. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers, and nothing sold papers faster than fear. Murders, disasters, ghost stories, they were all fodder for the presses. And here in the deserts of Egypt came the ultimate headline: An ancient curse awakens. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had already captured the world's imagination. The sheer wealth of treasure, the exotic setting, the idea of stepping into a chamber sealed for 3,000 years, it was irresistible But when Lord Carnarvon died, the press found its hook. They didn't just report it, they embroidered it. Blackouts, howling dogs, mysterious fevers, sudden accidents. Facts were twisted, coincidences exaggerated, rumors printed as truth. Each article added another brick to the growing monument of myth. The curse wasn't discovered, it was manufactured, headline by headline, edition by edition. Selling fear. Readers devoured the stories and circulation soared. Fear was profitable. Every whispered death linked to the tomb became a front-page spectacle. When a member of Carter's team caught pneumonia, when another suffered a car crash years later, no matter how mundane the cause, the narrative was clear. The Pharaoh had struck again. Publishers realized they had stumbled upon a gold mine as glittering as Tutankhamun's treasures. Books, pamphlets, and serialized accounts poured forth, each promising the true story of the curse. Spiritualist magazines declared the case open and shut proof of the supernatural. Even respected journals flirted with the idea, because the public's appetite for mystery was insatiable. The entertainment industry joins in. Soon, the myth escaped the newspapers and marched into popular culture. Museums promoted their Egyptian collections with whispers of curses to draw crowds. Theater productions staged plays about haunted mummies. Silent films depicted vengeful pharaohs stalking the living. Hollywood quickly realized the commercial power of Egyptomania. By the 1930s, films like The Mummy were already cementing the imagery: ancient tombs, eternal curses, death that walks in linen bandages. The cinematic pharaoh was no longer a historical relic, but a pop culture monster, as recognizable as Dracula or Frankenstein. Tourism also boomed. Western travelers flocked to Egypt, eager to see the Valley of the Kings for themselves. Ironically, the fear of the curse didn't repel them, it attracted them. To stand in the presence of a haunted tomb was a thrill too enticing to resist. The Egyptian government, museums, and tour operators leaned into the myth because myth meant money. From tragedy to trademark. The transformation was complete. What began as a series of personal tragedies became a cultural brand. The curse of the pharaohs was no longer a warning etched in stone, it was a commodity. The myth fed novels, paintings, Halloween costumes, comic books, even advertising campaigns. It became shorthand for forbidden knowledge and supernatural vengeance. Long after the actual excavation faded from the headlines, the curse endured because it was too lucrative to let die. The role of belief in commerce. What made the curse so marketable was the same thing that made it so believable: the human hunger for mystery. A straightforward death by infection doesn't sell, but a whispered death by curse? That sells. Tickets, papers, and box office seats. The line between truth and entertainment blurred. Reporters weren't just journalists, they were storytellers, crafting narratives that bent reality to fit the legend. Each retelling became more dramatic, more terrifying, more profitable. And as the stories spread, they gained the sheen of truth. People began to know the curse existed, not because of archaeology, but because it was everywhere, on stage, on screen, in the papers, in their nightmares. The pharaohs reborn as mythmakers. In a sense, the pharaohs achieved immortality not through their tombs, but through modern media. Their names, once buried in hieroglyphs, became household words. Tutankhamun, a relatively minor king in his own time, became the most famous pharaoh in history, not for his reign, but for his supposed vengeance. The irony is almost poetic. The very forces that the ancient Egyptians feared, grave robbers, desecrators, the theft of treasures, were now the forces keeping their memory alive. The curse that was meant to terrify had become a marketing tool, ensuring that the pharaohs remained eternal in the imagination of the living. Fear for sale. By the mid-20th century, the curse was no longer a superstition whispered in dark rooms. It was a cultural export, packaged and sold globally. And once money was involved, the myth proved unstoppable. The press had found its perfect story. Museums had found their perfect draw. Hollywood had found its perfect monster. Tourists had found their perfect thrill. And all of them, knowingly or not, were feeding the same beast. The curse of the pharaohs, a legend now more alive than the bodies it was said to guard.
The sands of Egypt have long since shifted. The men who first stepped into Tutankhamun's tomb are dust themselves, their bones resting quietly in distant graves. And yet, nearly a century later, the shadow of the pharaoh's curse has not vanished. It lingers, whispered in documentaries, revived in headlines, echoed in films, and passed down like folklore at the edge of candlelight. Modern echoes of an ancient fear. Consider how often the curse resurfaces in modern memory. In 1972, when Tutankhamun's treasures embarked on a world tour beginning in London, the press once again invoked the old whispers. Curators and museum staff were asked if they feared the wrath of the pharaoh. When minor mishaps occurred, an elevator stalling or a car accident near the exhibition, they were reported with an ominous twist. The curse had struck again. Decades later, in 2004, the death of a prominent Egyptologist, Nicholas Reeves, was speculated in tabloids as another victim of the pharaohs, despite his passing having nothing to do with Tutankhamun's tomb. In 2020, when a convoy of royal mummies was transferred to a new museum in Cairo, a string of unrelated accidents in Egypt, train derailments, factory collapse, were attributed by social media users to the curse. The myth is so resilient that even random tragedy bends to its gravity. The pharaoh's shadow still lingers not because of proof, but because of power, the power of story. The psychology of haunting. Why does the curse endure? Modern psychology offers one answer. Human beings are pattern seekers. We are drawn to connect events, especially when those events are shrouded in mystery or death. Randomness feels intolerable. It is far easier to imagine a grand design at work, even if that design is sinister. When a tragedy occurs in proximity to something sacred or forbidden, we reach instinctively for supernatural explanations. A car crash near a tomb becomes fate. A fever becomes punishment. Coincidence becomes curse. This reflex is not unique to Egypt. All cultures harbor warnings about breaking taboos, angering gods, or disturbing the dead. But Tutankhamun's tomb provided the perfect stage. A dazzling discovery, exotic allure, untimely deaths, and a world press eager to amplify fear. The result was not merely a curse, but a psychological feedback loop. Belief itself made the curse real. Those who feared it fell ill from stress. Those who read about it remembered only the deaths, not the survivors. And each retelling made the curse stronger. Survivors in the shadows. Because here lies the forgotten truth. Most of those involved with the tomb lived long lives. Howard Carter himself, the man who pried open the door and gazed upon Tutankhamun's golden mask, lived until 1939, nearly 20 years after the excavation. He died at 64 of natural causes. Dozens of archaeologists, workers, and officials connected with the discovery outlived the legend by decades. Yet their survival rarely made headlines. Death sells. Longevity does not. And so the myth grew lopsided, focusing only on those who cherished and ignoring the many who did not. But even if rationality dismisses the curse, the imagination refuses to let it go. For in the shadow of the tomb, facts pale beside fear. Egypt's eternal guardians. It is worth remembering that the ancient Egyptians themselves understood this psychological power. Tomb inscriptions warning of divine vengeance were not merely spiritual, they were practical. To a would-be grave robber, a line carved in stone that promised death by crocodile, plague, or the bite of serpents was as much a weapon as a locked door. In that sense, the curse of Tutankhamun did exactly what curses were always meant to do: protect the dead by terrifying the living. The difference is that instead of frightening thieves in the Valley of the Kings, it frightened an entire century of the modern world. Myth as immortality. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all.
Tutankhamun was a boy king of modest reign, overshadowed in his lifetime by greater pharaohs. Yet today, he is the most famous of them all. Not for his accomplishments in life, but for the myth born of his death. The so-called curse has ensured his immortality. His name is etched not only in hieroglyphics, but in headlines, books, films, and collective memory. The very superstition that science sought to debunk has become the vehicle of his eternal fame. Between skepticism and wonder. So where does that leave us a century later? On one side stand the skeptics, armed with microbiology, historical records, and rational explanation. On the other side stand the dreamers, who find in the curse a reminder that perhaps the world is not so easily explained. Most of us stand somewhere in between, drawn to the rational, yet still chilled by the possibility of mystery. After all, when we look into the hollow eyes of Anubis painted on a tomb wall or gaze upon the golden mask of the Boy King, a whisper stirs inside us. What if the old gods still keep watch? The curse lingers not because it is proven, but because it appeals to something timeless in human nature: our fascination with death, our fear of trespassing, and our need to believe that some forces lie beyond our control. A shadow without end. And so the legend endures, not in the sands of the Valley of the Kings, but in the human mind. It follows us through the pages of newspapers, across cinema screens, into late-night conversations. It lingers every time we hear of a death too coincidental, every time a museum exhibit sparks both awe and unease. The Pharaoh's shadow stretches long, not as a curse cast from the tomb, but as a reflection cast from within ourselves.
The flame of a candle flickers, then dies, leaving the tomb in silence. Darkness settles heavy against the walls, as if time itself exhales and closes the chapter. Perhaps there was never a curse carved by gods, never a spell woven into the stone. Perhaps the pharaohs of old did not reach from the afterlife to strike down the living. And yet, something far more enduring did awaken within those chambers. Not magic, not vengeance, but belief. The belief that death carries messages. The belief that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed. The belief that when the living disturb the eternal rest of the dead will answer. This belief, this faith in fear, is more powerful than any curse. It does not need hieroglyphs to be inscribed. It does not need priests to invoke it. It spreads quietly, invisibly, through whispers, headlines, and stories told in the dark. And in that way, the so-called curse of the pharaohs achieved immortality. For the truth, stripped bare, is simple. The curse never truly killed anyone. The deaths attributed to it were accidents of biology, coincidences of fate, tragedies magnified by circumstance. But through imagination, obsession, and the mighty engine of the press, these ordinary deaths became extraordinary. They were transformed into a narrative that enthralled millions and haunted history itself. It was never a curse written on stone. It was a curse written in ink. Ink on the pages of newspapers hungry for sensation. Ink in the scripts of films, novels, and documentaries that wove terror into entertainment. Ink that bound the legend tighter with each retelling, until the myth became more real than the facts. And so what began as a superstition in the Valley of the Kings grew into one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. A myth powerful enough to outlive science, reason, and even the men who first stepped into that tomb. Perhaps that is the true curse. Not the wrath of ancient gods, but the way truth can be buried beneath the sands of myth. Tutankhamun's golden mask still gazes out from behind glass, serene and eternal. Visitors shuffle past in hushed awe, caught between wonder and unease. Few remember that his reign was brief, his power limited, his life cut short. What they remember instead is the curse.
the legend that gave his name to eternity. The boy king has outshone even the mightiest pharaohs, not through conquest, not through monuments, but through a myth born of fear. The curse gave him what life had not: immortality. And we, the living, still play our part. Each time we whisper the story, each time we wonder, what if? Each time a flicker of unease passes over us in a museum or a darkened theater, the curse breathes again, not in the tomb, but in our imagination. That is the paradox of the Pharaoh's curse. It was never real, and yet it is real. It has shaped history, guided perceptions, and left shadows in our collective memory. The gods of Egypt may have remained silent, but humanity created a god of its own, the god of fear. As the last ember fades in the cavern of Tutankhamun's tomb, we are left with a truth as unsettling as any curse. The dead did not speak. We spoke for them. And in our fear, we gave their silence a voice louder than eternity. The curse of the Pharaoh is not death. It is the story. And the story will never die.